Hey everybody, we're back again with another video on acoustic room treatment with our resident expert here, Anthony Grimani, joining us once again. And today we're going to be focusing on what is referred to as diffusion and sometimes scattering. So this is going to be a real interesting discussion. Anthony, welcome back. And how are you doing today?
I am doing well. How about yourself, Christopher?
Great. It's good to see you.
Excellent. Yeah, there is definitely some confusion over the words diffusion and scattering, and I don't know that we have all the time to get into math. Acousticians, there are people, that's what they do. They studied acoustics, they have a degree in acoustics. There's also those that study psychoacoustics, which is not just how waves propagate, but how we perceive them, and those are called psychoacousticians. I always wanted to get a degree in psychoacoustics so I could tell, in a conversation at a bar, I'm a psychoacoustician, and the people walk away. So what's interesting in the conversation around diffusion and scattering is a lot of it is about how we perceive sound, not just a study of the plain acoustics, the physics of it, but also what feels good, what sounds good. And there's a lot of that conversation around why use devices that either scatter or diffuse. In very broad terms, a scattering device is, and I'll show you some pictures, is basically any shape that's a little broken in which the sound that's coming to it, rather than bounce off a hard surface, gets scattered in many different directions via really some odd shapes. The term diffusion refers more to the generalized averaging of the scattering, and there are certain types of panels that are more diffusers than scattering devices, and it's kind of a subtlety. In the end, really what you're looking for is in order to get good sound to where you psychoacoustically go, wow, this thing sounds great. You want some amount of these devices that break up the reflections. Don't absorb them, just let them stay in the room, but break them up into smaller pieces. So let's take a look at some diagrams about all this. So switching over to a little PowerPoint. Can you confirm that you can see this?
Yeah, looks great. About
scattering and diffusion. So in an earlier one of these little talks, I discussed the fact that rooms wrapped around speakers or wrapped around oboes or violins end up resulting in reflections. I like the way I say wrapped around. It really is. It's a speaker inside a room, but the walls that are around those speakers receive some of the sounds from the speaker or the instrument if you're recording it, and they reflect it back, just like an acoustic version of a mirror. And some amount of those reflections are okay. A lot of them, and a lot of them out of control, are not okay. We talked about the fact that there's some tools to control that, and we've discussed absorbers and base absorbers already. This one's going to be about this other tool called scattering devices or diffusers. So the idea is shown in this diagram that you've got, here's a room that's got 3 speakers across the front of it for either home theater or multi-channel immersive audio recording. And you got a saxophone playing out of that speaker. That saxophone, the sound of that saxophone comes out of the speaker and ends up at your ear, the direct field of it. And some of the sound of that saxophone, either because it's a speaker radiating it out, and speakers have pretty wide dispersion, or the saxophone itself, also goes over to the wall and bounces back and creates a replica of the saxophone, makes it sound weird. So if you put a scattering device there, that wave that I'm showing here as an arrow, it's not really an arrow, that's just conceptually, but that direction of the sound wave with the scattering device gets broken into smaller pieces. So what returns back to your ear is a smaller amount of reflection, and it just helps support the sound of the saxophone rather than detract from it. So another way to look at this is this same kind of room seen from above, loudspeakers at the top of our diagram, and it looks like a red box with a horn on it. But here's this loudspeaker. It's going to generate a signal path that I call the direct path from it to you, the listener. And then off axis, there would be a reflection, but if you put some kind of scattering diffuser, it breaks that reflection into smaller pieces. And those smaller pieces just feel better. Psychoacoustically, they just make the sound be smoother and more enjoyable. So we're going to talk here in the next 15, 20 minutes about the use of scattering materials. Those can be and should be for good quality purpose-built panels. Some people just put bookcases there. So you put a bookcase on the wall with books at all different depths and you get some kind of scattering. I don't know what kind of scattering, some kind of scattering. So it's a little random. I prefer when people actually use a properly engineered, purpose-built panel that has a known scattering character over a range of frequencies that's known, that's put in the right place. If you're serious about your sound, either as a recording person or as a audiophile or cinephile, person who likes movies, go ahead and spend a little money on purpose-built panels. So now, what do those diffusers do? In plain English terms, they help create the right pattern for reflections. So a speaker or an instrument, you want the direct sound, you want some amount of reflections, you want to absorb some of those reflections, and then you want to scatter them around, and the right kind of purpose-built diffuser is going to scatter that the right way. The other cool thing they do is that they avoid what's called flutter reflections in the room. So if you start with the concepts explained before in previous talks, you start with a room, you put some number of absorbers on the walls. I don't know if do you remember what was the target amount of absorption in the room, Christopher?
15%.
15%. So I just keep saying that, and I keep saying that because I want people to really register that. If you want people to understand or remember something, you just keep repeating it until they go, oh, okay, I get it. Why 15%? Because any more than 15% absorption in a typical listening room or mixed studio is too dead. It's too much.
Right. And I also think it's so important to get that out there because it at least in my mind, it just makes the whole concept of doing this way less scary.
Yeah.
It's not that expensive. You're only going to treat 15% of your walls. It's just not that crazy, and then you get such a huge return in your investment.
Right. So if you only cover 15% of the walls with panels, that does mean there's still a fair amount of exposed surface, and there's a chance that there'd be two parallel or even non-parallel exposed surfaces in front of each other, and there could be a flutter echo there. Mm-hmm. And so if there's a flutter echo, a flutter echo, by the way, is a thing that when you clap your hands and you listen to it right at that position, you hear it going, it's like a little zingy sound.
Yeah, they're horrible.
So what do? You add an absorber? No, now it's too dead. That's where the diffuser comes in really handy. You put a diffuser on one side or the other, or both sides, and instead of the sound bouncing back and forth, every time the sound hits the wall, it gets scattered and just doesn't keep going. So that's a good way to get rid of flutter echoes without deadening the room. Now, another interesting thing is diffusers. This is kind of a weird thing. Diffusers make absorbers work harder. What? So you put an absorber in a room, and what it's going to absorb is the sound that comes from the speaker or the oboe. I keep coming back to that oboe you like so much. And then absorbs it. And, there's no other waves it's going to absorb. Maybe it'll absorb another wave that has bounced somewhere else. But if you put diffusers in the room where the sound is re-radiated in all directions, the chance that the waves from that diffuser find an absorber somewhere are increased.
Mm-hmm.
So they make absorbers work better. And the cool thing about that is as you start to add diffusers in the room, you'll notice sometimes that the room gets more and more dead because the net diffused energy, the net free-flowing energy in the room of the waves finds absorbers more. So you can actually reduce, if you start to add diffusers in the room, you can reduce the absorbers. And maintaining that liveness in the room is really key to a believable sound. A room that's too dead is unbelievable, just is not pleasant, and diffusers just help psychoacoustically as well as, I guess, measurably acoustically in improving the sound quality. So the whole idea is to keep liveness in the room while at the same time having good spatial definition in the room. And those have usually been opposites. The more spacious a room sounds, the livelier it is, the less accurate the position of the sounds in the room ends up being. You can't quite tell where the singer, where the drummer, where the guitarist are if there's a lot of spaciousness in the room. But if you balance a certain number of absorbers and some certain number of diffusers correctly located in the room, you end up with the best of all worlds, which is a room that's damped enough but still has that openness to it. So now, diffusers come from all kinds of different manufacturers. All kinds of people claim I make a diffuser, a scattering device. Just like with absorbers, where we talked about that in the previous presentation, they need to be deep enough. And I don't know if you remember, like in the case of absorbers, if they're too thin, they just only work at higher frequencies. Same thing with diffusers. I don't actually have numbers here for you, but a 2-inch diffuser, typical 2-inch diffuser, there's a whole bunch of different topologies I'll get into, only works down to 1 kilohertz. You remember that a 2-inch absorber typically works down to 500 hertz. Yeah. In the case of a diffuser, it's all cut up to twice the frequency, half the wavelength. So when you buy a diffuser that's 2 inches deep, it's only going to work down to 1 kilohertz. Unless it's a very special topology. There's a few people who make what is 2 inches deep, but actually if you were to slice the thing open, you'll see that there's actually wells inside in which the waves propagate inside there. So the effective depth is actually 4 or 6. But typical diffusers that rely on scattering kind of patterns, you really want them to be at least 4 inches deep and preferably 6 or more. Must be deep enough. Now, if a bit of diffusion is good, why don't we just fill the whole room with diffusers?
Too much salt in the food.
Too much salt. Maybe I'll talk about this like salt and pepper. Yeah. I love salt. I love pepper. There's just the right amount.
Yeah.
So just like too much absorption makes a room sound just dead and uncomfortable, too much diffusion is too diffused, and you end up with confusion. Your brain just goes, dude, I don't get it. I see that I'm in this room. I should expect some amount of reflections, but everything that's coming back is uncorrelated, is scattered, doesn't work well. Now, there are people who've built studios that way. There's a notable studio in the U.S. That will go unnamed, actually, where they just put deep diffusers everywhere, and it has a particular tone to it. And when you ask folks, well, what do you think? It's like, well, it's different. Yeah, it's different. I just wouldn't recommend it. Even to people like Christopher who sell diffusers, I would say there's just the right amount. And guess what that right amount turns out to be?
15 to 20%?
15 to 20%. It's always in that range, not too much. You may remember this diagram from an earlier presentation where I showed if you put an impulsive sound in a room and you looked at how it comes back to your ears over time in an untreated room, you would get this kind of thing where there'd be a direct sound coming from the source, the speaker, or the rim shot from a snare that's over there. And then you'd get individual reflections that come back, bang, 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 and just make the sound unpleasant. Or if it was a microphone, makes it sound bad. All of these tight, clustered reflections just don't sound good in recording. And you remember how I said, what we're targeting is something in which the decay time is right, the reflections in the room are right, and they're evenly spaced. Diffusion is what smooths out these reflections. Absorption is what brings them down somewhat, only 15%, and diffusion is what breaks them up in time so that train of reflections over time is just smooth and it's just more pleasant to your ear. So, overall, in terms of scattering, you need enough scattering surfaces to smooth out the sound field, and that's typically only 15 to 20% of the surface area of the walls and the ceiling. They must be thick. Okay, again, a 1 or 2 inch diffuser, unless it's one of those special patterns, it's sort of a nestled diffuser. Typically look for things that are 4 to 12 inches deep. That's 10 to 30 centimeters deep. And you want to balance the amount and locations of the scattering and absorber panels. I generally like to interleave them. I've seen designs for years that put all the diffusion in the back wall, all the absorption in the front wall.
Yeah.
And that's been shown repeatedly by psychoacousticians. Not people who sell panels, because they want to sell a lot of them, but people who've actually studied, hey, how does this sound? To not sound good. It causes confusion. There's a very good Audio Engineering Society paper called About Diffusion and Confusion that goes into why that doesn't work so well. So in general, you want to interleave them. I think, Christopher, we'll do a session sometime where we put this all together, where we actually show where do you put absorbers, where do you put diffusers, what types and stuff like that. But we'll talk about that.
That'd be great.
And to me, scattering devices, diffusers, scattering panels, this is stuff that high-end rooms are made of. Essentially, you start with a room that's all live, that has no treatments, and that's a low-end room. I don't care how good of a speaker amp you put in there. It's just not going to sound good. You add in some absorbers, wow, it starts to sound better. But if you really want to get to high-quality, high-end performance, you need to have some judiciously located and specified and engineered scattering and diffusion panels.
And also, that's just the greatest amount of accuracy and the least amount of fatigue, right?
Right. That leads to just a more comfortable, more laid back kind of sound where it's less fatigue and more comfortable to listen to. So now, diffusers come in all kinds of different types. I'm going to loosely categorize them into two general areas. Either what I call a hemidisc diffuser. That's a diffuser panel in which the sound that leaves the source hits the panel and it gets redirected on one plane, what's known technically as a hemidisc, half of a disc. A disc is a thing that goes all the way around. This is a hemidisc because the diffuser is usually on the wall. So sound hits it, it bounces back. I call that a 2D diffuser simply because the incoming vector gets turned into 2 dimensions. That does not refer to the mathematical coefficient that predicts the diffusion character. There's a certain amount of math you'll see on the internet or in books written by people who have been studying those that refers to the quadratic residue diffusion not the coefficient, but there's a number you use in figuring out that. That's not what I'm talking about. That D is not that number. I'm talking about the dimension in which the diffuser, the scattering device, redirects the sound. I generally like to use those on the side walls, between the front wall where the speakers or the source are, up to about your seating position, where the sounds of the speakers hit those and redirected, and they stay in the horizontal plane. They don't get redirected to the ceiling or to the floor. They just stay on the horizontal plane. And then another broad category I'm going to call is 3D diffusers. I'm going to call hemisphere. Sound that hits them gets redirected in 3 dimensions, but half of a sphere because they're on the wall, so they can't radiate back. They're just redirecting, evenly like a hemisphere. And again, that 3D is not the coefficients of a quadratic residue equation. It's just a concept that the sound that hits it gets redirected in 3 dimensions. I usually like to use those from your seating position back and on the back wall and on the top of the ceiling. And on the back wall, I don't like them all the way around the back wall. I like the middle of the back wall to be absorption. We'll talk about that in our session on putting it all together, but kind of towards the outer edges of the back wall. If you're doing a room that's for multi-channel sound, for surround sound or immersive audio, if you place those around where surround speakers and top speakers are, it takes the sound of those speakers and smooths it out, scatters it out, and gives you a much more believable immersive character. So generally speaking, here's a look of some 2D diffusers. A cylinder, a polycylinder, or a regular single cylinder, the sound that hits that is going to get scattered out just in this plane. But also slotted diffusers, where there's a lot of manufacturers presenting those, the sound that hits those slots, that is only one direction, gets scattered kind of perpendicular to them, right? If you look at the sound going in that direction, it just goes into the wells and goes back out. But the sound that goes in this direction bounces off the edges with a few different processes, usually a diffractive process, and it gets scattered out. This is just redirecting, this is scattering through diffraction. Whereas 3-dimensional diffusers in the simplest form, let me go to my diagram doesn't work here for my pyramid, but in the simplest form, you can think of a pyramid shape as one in which the incoming sound would hit that and get redirected in 4 directions. That's not a very sophisticated diffuser. It's or scattering device. It's a start point compared to a flat wall. It will do something. There are more sophisticated approaches, including these kinds of devices that have these broken shapes all the way around, and the sound gets redirected hemispherically through a scattering process of diffraction. And here's two more shapes, but basically when you see those kinds of things that have either wells that are all arranged in a like kind of an egg crate at different depths, or these things that looks like skylines, those are going to be three-dimensional diffusers. Here's some more commercial diffusers you can buy. These are pretty expensive types. This will scatter horizontally when you put it on the sidewall. This is a 2D diffuser, and this is going to scatter horizontally and vertically. That's a 3D diffuser. Christopher, I always ask, does this help? Does this help clarify this whole confusing mess about scattering devices? What are they for? Where do you put them, etc.?
I really think it does. I think it's really great the way this video series is able to kind of parse out the three main categories of acoustical treatment requirements, from absorption to low-end absorption or bass traps, and diffusion or scattering.
Yeah. You've got a bunch of different options in your catalog. So let's take a look at that. So if you can share that screen. Okay, so tell me about this thing called a four-fuser. I see it's categorized as a 2D diffuser. Tell us a little bit about it.
So here we have the Sonatus 4-fuser, which is a 2D diffuser. It's a 24 by 24 by a little over 3-inch device, or 60 by 60 by 8 centimeters. And you can see that the diffusion on this is from around 4 kilohertz down to 600 hertz. It is made of a hard expanded polystyrene that is further hardened by a coating of acrylic paint.
Oh, cool. Yep.
Yeah, and it comes in 3 different colors. As you had mentioned, it's good for use in the front half of the room. Mm-hmm. It's super easy to install. They're not heavy products to deal with, and it's got kind of a cool industrial look that people like.
Cool. Great. And so that it says it's available in black, white, or gray, right? So you can match it to your interior.
Yeah.
Tell me about this guy.
Well, this is one of my favorites in this category, and it's called the 6-strip. And the reason I love it is it's a 2-in-1 product. Mm. As you can see at the top here, it's a 2D diffuser and an absorber. So it's a really cool device that's kind of knocking out 2 of the 3 pins, if you will, in this trifecta. And just like a lot of the other products we sell, it's a 24 by 24 size item, about 3 inches in depth. And the scattering on this starts at around 6 kilohertz, goes down to about 1,000 hertz, and then if you can see below that, the absorption range is about 3K down to 250. So it's a very cool device that really is killing 2 birds with 1 stone, if you will. Right.
Yeah, what I like about this is it absorbs in the region you need it, but not too much at the higher frequencies where it'll sap out the openness of the room, but it scatters over a pretty good range. Cool.
Yeah, it's a super cool device.
It's solid wood, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so it's got a nice natural look. It's kind of got a studio feel to it. I really like it a lot.
So we're seeing it here in sort of it's an oak, but it's also available in fully black, right? Where the wood slats are all black. Cool.
Yeah, that's right. And so then it looks a little less of a contrast there for the aesthetic.
All right, let's talk about this thing. Now we're talking about a real diffuser looking thing.
I thought you would like this one because this gets into the 3D diffusion. And this is called our Big Fuser 1, which, as you can see, is a 3D diffuser. It's 24 by 24 by 6 inches, so we're getting some of that extra depth there that you were looking for. And the range is 6 kilohertz all the way down to 300 hertz. Again, it's a hard expanded polystyrene that's coated with a hardened acrylic paint. And just like the other product, it's available in black, white, and gray. And as you had mentioned, these are best used in the back half of the room and then up on the ceiling as well.
Cool. Same. Yeah, that looks good. Now, I notice you also have Big Fuser 2.
Yes.
Pretty much same, right? Just an aesthetic, a different aesthetic wrap, right?
It's a different aesthetic wrap, and it is also a 3D diffuser. It's about the same dimensions as the Big Fuser one,
Mm-hmm.
made of the same product. Again, applications about the same.
Yeah.
It really just is dependent on kind of what you're looking for aesthetically in the room.
Yeah. So I bet the wells, all of the shapes of the diffraction wells in there are the same between the two, just kind of wrapped around. That's cool. And that, yeah, that you can
Comes in
see here. It's
white and
available in
gray.
black or white, and I think
Yeah.
gray too. Cool. Now let's look
Ooh,
at this thing. Ooh,
yeah.
he says.
This is the big bad boy here. This is the Big Fuser 2 solid oak. So that's a heavier, dense solid oak product. It's also a 3D diffuser that's curved, as you can see. And the depth on this guy is a full 7 inches deep. So we're going to get a little bit lower on the frequency range. We're starting out at 6 kilohertz and getting all the way down to 270.
That's great.
Again, made of solid wood. Comes in a few different colors to match whatever people's needs are in their rooms. And just like all of them, they're probably best used in the back half of the room and up on the ceiling. But
Right.
this guy's a little bit heavy, so be forewarned. He's a chunky one.
Gotta start to work up those muscles before you install that. Cool. Yeah, this looks like a nice range of diffusers, both 2D and 3D, both cost effective.
Yeah.
And a little higher luxury. I mean, this wood piece, I'm sure, is gorgeous on the wall. So yeah,
It looks
nice
incredible. Yeah.
Cool. So next time, Christopher, we get together, I want to do a little presentation on putting this all together. You know, you got all these absorbers, these diffusers. We talked about the theory of them, how many you need, but let's talk about where you put them in various types of rooms, whether it's a mix room, a live room for doing recording, a 2-channel audiophile room, or a multi-channel immersive audio home theater. There's a bunch of different layouts for these things. We can cover that if you want next time.
I would love it, man. That'll be the perfect end to this entire series. So let's do that for sure, ASAP. We will circle back, everybody, as soon as we can, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Anthony.
Great. All right. Thank you, Christopher.
Okay, man. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.